Try to sit with what that actually meant. A small child, taken from the only country, the only language, and the only mother she had ever known, put on a ship bound for a cold, unfamiliar island on the other side of the world, and a mother left standing on a dock in Surat, with no legal claim to her own daughter, no promise of letters, and, as it turned out, no future contact of any kind. Theodore Forbes died in 1820 aboard a ship on his way back to Britain. Whatever plans he may have had for Eliza, whatever correspondence might once have existed between them, none of it survives in any meaningful way. Dr. Jim Wilson, reflecting on the research years later, has noted how little is actually known about Eliza's later life, including even the date of her death. She has no confirmed grave. She has no confirmed obituary. As far as the official record is concerned, she simply disappears from history the moment her daughter's ship left the harbor. Catherine, for her part, grew up in Scotland. She was raised as a young British gentlewoman, given an education and, in time, married into Scottish society. Her descendants would not know it, but her mother's mitochondrial DNA had traveled with her, quietly passed from mother to daughter in every generation that followed, waiting nearly 200 years to be read. Here is where the story becomes less about tragedy and more about the deliberate erasure of a woman's identity. For generations, the Spencer family's own genealogical records described Eliza Kydd not as Indian, but as Armenian. It wasn't a small misunderstanding. It was a specific, repeated choice, carried forward through decades of family history, society pages, and formal genealogies, right up until the DNA testing in 2013. The reasoning isn't hard to understand once you consider the world the Forbes and Spencer families were operating in. Victorian Britain was obsessed with lineage, and it viewed racial purity as something to be guarded, particularly among families with any pretensions to gentility or nobility. An Armenian ancestor, especially one connected to a respected merchant community with a long documented presence in international trade, could be absorbed into a family story as something exotic, but ultimately acceptable, even faintly romantic. An Indian ancestor, and particularly one born to an unmarried relationship between a British merchant and his household employee, was a different matter entirely. It carried a stigma the family clearly wanted to avoid passing down to their children. So the story changed. Eliza Kydd's Armenian father became the entire explanation for her background, and her Indian mother was left out of the account altogether. It's worth noting that Eliza did have genuine Armenian heritage through her father, and letters addressed to her were apparently written in Armenian script, which gave the family a plausible foundation to build the story on. But building a story on a partial truth is still building a lie, and the effect was the same either way. An Indian woman's identity was folded into something more palatable to a family, climbing the social ladder of the British aristocracy. This version of events held for well over a century. It held through Catherine's marriage, through her children's marriages, through the birth of Ruth Gill, through Ruth's marriage into the Fermoy barony, through the birth of Francis Roche, and right through to the moment Francis's daughter, Lady Diana Spencer, walked down the aisle at St. Paul's Cathedral in 1981 to marry the Prince of Wales. The family's own paperwork, presumably known to at least some of its senior members, still described Eliza as Armenian. Nobody apparently thought to question it, or if they did, nobody said so publicly. The path from Catherine Forbes to Princess Diana runs through several generations of women, each one unknowingly carrying Eliza's mitochondrial signature forward. Catherine's line continued through her descendants until it reached Ruth Sylvia Gill, born in 1908 in Aberdeenshire, Scotland. Ruth trained as a concert pianist in her youth before marrying Maurice Roche, the 4th Baron Fermoy, in 1931. The Fermoys were part of Britain's landed aristocracy, and Maurice Roche was, notably, a friend of King George VI, which placed the family in close social proximity to the royal household well before Diana was ever born. Ruth and Maurice had 3 children, one of whom was a daughter named Frances Ruth Roche. On the 1st of June 1954, Frances married John Spencer, then known by the courtesy title Viscount Althorp, in a ceremony at Westminster Abbey. She was 18 years old at the time, making her the youngest bride to marry at the Abbey in roughly 50 years, and members of the royal family, including Queen Elizabeth II, attended the wedding. It was, by any measure, a significant society event, covered extensively in the press of the day, and yet nobody covering that wedding, and quite possibly nobody attending it, knew that the bride carried a rare strand of mitochondrial DNA passed down from a woman who had been erased from her own family's records more than a century earlier. Francis and John Spencer went on to have 5 children. Their first son, John, lived only a matter of hours after his birth in January 1960. On the 1st of July 1961, the couple welcomed a daughter, Diana Frances Spencer. Diana grew up on the Sandringham estate, close enough to the royal family that she played as a child alongside Princes Andrew and Edward. When her grandfather died in 1975 and her father inherited the Spencer earldom, she became Lady Diana Spencer, the identity most of the world would come to know her by 6 years later, when she married the Prince of Wales in front of a global television audience estimated at hundreds of millions of people. At no point in that fairy tale narrative, the dress with its enormous train, the balcony kiss at Buckingham Palace, the years of intense media attention that followed, did the story of Eliza Kewark surface. The family's genealogical records still listed her as Armenian, as far as the public understood it, and as far as most of the family itself apparently understood it. There was no reason to think otherwise. It's worth pausing here to explain why this particular kind of genetic testing carries so much weight, because it isn't the same as an ordinary ancestry test that estimates broad percentages of regional heritage. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited exclusively through the maternal line. A father's mitochondrial DNA is not passed on to his children at all. Only a mother passes hers down to both sons and daughters, though only her daughters will pass it on again to the next generation. Because of this narrow single-line inheritance, mitochondrial DNA changes very slowly over time, accumulating mutations at a much slower rate than the rest of the genome. That slow rate of change is precisely what makes it useful for tracing ancestry across many generations. A mitochondrial sequence found today can, in the right circumstances, be matched to a documented ancestor who lived 2 centuries ago, because the sequence simply hasn't had much opportunity to change. This means that Prince William and Prince Harry carry, essentially unaltered, the same mitochondrial DNA that belonged to their mother, Diana, who inherited it from Francis, who inherited it from Ruth, who inherited it from a chain of mothers and daughters stretching back to Catherine Forbes, and ultimately, to Eliza Kewark herself. The specific haplogroup involved, R30b, is not just rare in a general sense. Researchers compared it against a database of tens of thousands of samples collected from populations around the world, and found only a small number of exact or closely related matches, concentrated almost entirely in India, with a single case in Nepal. No matches turned up anywhere in Europe. No matches turned up in Armenia. The genetic evidence pointed in one direction, and it flatly contradicted the story the family had told about itself for generations. Because mitochondrial DNA only tells part of the story, the researchers also looked at broader whole genome ancestry markers in living relatives of Diana's line. That analysis estimated that her documented descendants carry a small but measurable percentage of South Asian ancestry, generally estimated in the range of a fraction of 1%, consistent with an ancestor 8 generations back. It's a modest number in absolute terms, but modest is not the same as meaningless. It is a hard genetic confirmation of something the family's paperwork had spent nearly 2 centuries denying. When Britain's DNA published its findings in June 2013, the story made headlines around the world. Newspapers ran variations on the same theme. The future King of England had confirmed Indian ancestry, a detail no one in his family's official history had ever acknowledged. Dr. Jim Wilson, speaking to reporters at the time, described the finding as a striking example of how modern genetics can answer very specific historical questions, and noted that the evidence tying Eliza Kewark's line to South Asia was, in his words, effectively beyond dispute. Royal historians weighed in as well, generally framing the discovery as a fascinating illustration of how far genetic science had come, and how much of ordinary family history simply never survives in written form. What's notable is what didn't happen next. The royal family itself made no public statement about the finding, either at the time or in the years that followed. William and Harry have not addressed it publicly. There was no formal acknowledgement from the palace, no attempt to highlight the connection during royal visits to India, including the tour William and Kate undertook in 2016, which focused on official engagements, rather than any exploration of this particular thread of family history. Whether that silence reflects a simple preference for privacy around personal ancestry, or something more complicated tied to how the institution manages its public image, is something outsiders can really only speculate about. What can be said with more confidence is that a family which had spent nearly 200 years quietly recasting an Indian ancestor as Armenian did not, once confronted with hard genetic proof, rush to correct the record in any public way. Eliza Kewark's story is not unique, even if the details of her particular case eventually became famous. Throughout the era of East India Company rule, relationships between British merchants and Indian or Anglo-Indian women were common, and the resulting children occupied a strange, often precarious social position. Some were acknowledged and brought into British households, many were not. Mothers like Eliza, without the protection of marriage or formal legal standing, had essentially no recourse if a British father decided to take their children back to Britain permanently. The Victorian era's fixation on lineage and racial categorization only made the situation worse, giving families a strong incentive to quietly rewrite inconvenient details out of their own histories, rather than risk the social consequences of acknowledging them. Theodore Forbes very likely understood exactly what kind of prejudice his mixed-race children would face if their full parentage were widely known, which may explain both his decision to raise Catherine in Britain, away from her mother, and his family's later decision to reframe Eliza's identity rather than simply omit her from the record altogether. It was, in its own grim way, a functional strategy. Catherine married comfortably into Scottish society. Her descendants moved steadily up the social ladder over the following century, culminating in a marriage into the highest levels of the British aristocracy and eventually into the royal family itself. None of it would have been quite so simple if the family's true, complete ancestry had been common knowledge at any point along the way. Eliza Kewark herself remains, in the most literal sense, a woman without an ending. There is no confirmed date of her death, no located grave, no letter in her own hand that historians have been able to point to with confidence. What we know about her is drawn almost entirely from the paperwork of the men who employed her and fathered her children, documents that describe her in passing as a housekeeper, as a purported mother, never quite as a full person in her own right. It's a strange kind of historical fate to be significant enough that your genetic signature eventually reaches a future British monarch, and yet so overlooked in your own lifetime that almost nothing survives to tell us who you actually were. Of mothers and daughters through a Scottish marriage, an aristocratic title, a wedding at Westminster Abbey, and finally through Diana, Princess of Wales, to her sons, and through her granddaughter, to the next generation of the royal family. Only Princess Charlotte among William's children would be capable of passing that same mitochondrial line forward again, since inheritance runs strictly through daughters. What has survived is her DNA, carried quietly and invisibly through 8 generations. It's a small, almost invisible thread connecting the modern British monarchy to a woman who lived and worked in a trading port in Western India more than 200 years ago, and who was denied even the basic dignity of being remembered accurately by her own descendants. There's a temptation to treat a story like this as simple royal trivia, an unusual footnote to be filed away next to other odd facts about famous bloodlines. But it's worth sitting with what actually happened here a little longer. A family with enormous social standing took a woman's real identity and quietly replaced it with a more convenient one, and that replacement held for the better part of 2 centuries, surviving multiple generations of marriages, a world war, the end of the British Empire in India, and the most heavily photographed wedding of the 20th century. Before a piece of laboratory equipment finally caught the lie,